Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. We're here with our next and final lecture on urban sociology. We've learned a lot about how we define urban areas. We've learned about place and space as how we understand urban areas. Well, now I want to spend some time thinking about place and some of the potential negative impacts that we can experience from place. At the end of the previous lecture, we talked about some positive things like the Smithsonian and even some of the unique things like Chicago hot dogs. But now I want to think about how it can impact you in unexpectedly negative ways. Place can really be a blessing, or it can be something that is just a non-issue, or it can be devastating, depend on where you might live in that city and where you might fall in that stratification pyramid that we talked about in our stratification lectures. One of the things that we're now seeing is that a lot of urban spaces are experiencing increased distances between persons who have a lot of resources and persons who have few. In fact, we talked about this idea at the end of our stratification lecture series, something that we call social distance. Social distance is the idea that people who have lots of resources and people who have few resources live further and further apart, and the two don't really understand how each other live. One of the common things that is said from people who have more resources is, well, people should just work harder. But people who have few resources realize that work is just one small part of that. Having access to things like education is far more apt to give you mobility in terms of your lifetime. Hard work is great, but it can only do so much given the rigidity of our stratification pyramid. Even though we have mobility, it can be very limited. That's not to discount hard work. I am a strong believer in the idea of working hard and making do with the resources that you have. But that said, we also have to realize that hard work only does so much. Now, with urban areas, as we see an increase in social distance, there's a couple of things that I want to talk about. The first is the idea of gentrification. Gentrification is a really common example of what happens when we have areas that are high poverty, that as a city changes, they suddenly become very valuable. There are parts of Lexington where long before I was a professor, long before I had my PhD, that I visited in coming to Lexington to play music that were wildly different than they are now. I think about some of the places like Al's Bar, for example. That was a neighborhood that when I visited here was very poor. It was very different than it is today. And it was an area, too, that was actually a bit dangerous because there just really wasn't a strong police presence there. Today, that's an area that's experiencing gentrification. And that's because that as Lexington grew in popularity as a city and as it expanded, it could only go in so many different directions. And so the area around Al's Bar and that whole community on Limestone near campus suddenly became very valuable to the college. In fact, it became an area where people started buying the old houses, renovating them, and reselling them for a lot of profit. Likewise, they also often turned into rental areas. Gentrification started happening because then the community that had existed there for 60, 70, who knows how many years, slowly but surely was being pushed out. One of the big things that we see now is that with gentrified areas, tax values will change. Your property that maybe was only getting charged, $200 or $300 a year in city taxes was suddenly getting charged $2,000 or $3,000 because your home value, even though it wasn't particularly valuable to you necessarily, was increasing because the property where your home sat was valuable. This creates lots of problems. Situations where people who lived there cannot pay the taxes and are there forced out into other areas, sometimes through foreclosures, sometimes through evictions if they had been renting there because the rents would go up. And over time, that area changes. While some would argue this is good for the economy, and that's a fair argument in some situations, it also overlooks that a lot of people are devastated by it. It pushes people out. As someone who studies outdoor recreation, this is also something that I gradually see in outdoor recreation areas, including the Red River Gorge, that it might be an issue that comes up in the future. Now, as social distance increases, we also see, too, that other resource-isolated areas that maybe don't increase in value, they become further and further separated from the rest of the city. And in fact, we see some really interesting things that have happened since the 1950s in terms of suburbanation that has changed how inner areas of cities often work. Likewise, we're seeing that gentrification is yet again coming in and changing even that. So what I want to do is go back in time, and I want to try to understand how poor inner city areas often were created. And this is a fairly common theme that applies to most, but not all, big cities. We see that certain areas became very poor since the 1950s as more and more people moved away and took businesses with them. However, we're now seeing that gentrification is changing that, and so areas that were very poor downtowns are now becoming very sought after areas where housing can be extraordinarily expensive, which is again pushing people out of the area. Let's explore that a little bit. So we have to go back in time to talk a little bit about what happens. Suburbanization, by the way, was the creation of the suburbs in the areas surrounding cities, and it ends up changing how cities function. Now, starting in 1934, we get the National Housing Act. And the National Housing Act is really amazing because it makes, for the first time, a government-backed mortgage a real thing. At the time, most people were renting houses or renting apartments and things like that because they couldn't afford to own their own homes. You needed a lot of resources to be able to buy a house. However, now that we have mortgages, as we think of them today, that are government insured, saying that the government would basically take the check if someone bailed on their mortgage, banks were suddenly willing to let people who previously could not get into houses get into houses. But this was also a period of time in which segregation was the law of the land. Plessy v. Ferguson had legalized the idea of equal but separate housing. We typically today remember it as separate but equal, and the differences between those two phrases are very notable, but I'll let you look up the Wikipedia page about Plessy v. Ferguson in that decision. But basically it made segregation a legal thing, and so people could be allowed to establish basically single race communities. That meant that, this could be a community that only white people could live in. In fact, it was a thing, if you look back in deeds at the time, that you'd even see situations where only white people per the deed were allowed to live in those communities. It's kind of like an agreement. So segregation became a lawful thing. Nonetheless, we do see persons of color developing certain communities. So we start to see black neighborhoods as well as white neighborhoods. That changes in the 1950s, and it talks about, it brings up the issue of something called the white flight phenomenon, which has probably been mediaized a little bit. It's been made into a bigger idea than probably what it was, but it nonetheless is important. With the white flight phenomenon in the 1950s, what we begin to see is the breakdown of segregation. 1954 is when we have the Brown v. Board of Education decision, which is where the justices unanimously come together and say that segregation is harmful. Harmful is the word that they use, and I think that's a very valuable word to describe it. And so we start to see schools desegregated. We start to see segregation, too, in these communities becoming an illegal thing. Now, what happens is we have these all-white communities, and a handful of persons of color begin to move into them. But this ends up becoming something that was really exacerbated by real estate agents, because they started sort of saying, hey, because persons of colors have moved into this community, we think that the value of your land is going to change. And this would create a situation where people who are white might decide to flee white flight to other communities. And so then the real estate agent could sell them a new house, plus they now have the opportunity to sell the old house that they moved from. So it was something that probably wouldn't have happened in the same way that it did on its own, but was really exacerbated by a lot of greedy real estate persons who made a lot of money off that. What they ended up doing was slowly but surely breaking up a lot of communities, running off persons who were white, and they would go into other communities that were often all white, and then we start changes in these communities where new people would move in. The combined effect of this, though, starts to do something really weird with the downtown urban areas. As we start to see people moving around, we see some shifting. People who had the resources to be able to get a mortgage would often move to the suburbs because it offered a really great way to get out of the heart of the city, which was congested. There was noise, there was traffic, there was pollution, and so forth. So they could get out of that into the countryside, and that kind of makes sense. And even the creation of things like interstates and rails and so forth would allow them to still work in the city, but they could live outside of it. What ends up happening too, though, is they move from a lot of these downtown areas, and people who already lived in the city often move in to the areas that were left open. But what is this weird switch that happens is a lot of the people who owned businesses downtown pulled their businesses away as they moved. And what generally happened is they either saw a situation where they would want to move their business closer to where they lived now, or B, they were moving their business because so many people had left the downtown that their clients weren't visiting there anymore. When we hear phrases about the death of the downtown that you might hear in all sorts of small towns, that's kind of what was happening, is the people who would shop there were moving out from the area. There wasn't the foot traffic that we once had. And so now we start to see these downtown businesses really starting to go into a downward spiral. And the ones that stick behind are often going out of business because there's not enough customers there to support it. What ends up happening too is the city is sprawling. Sprawl means that the city is getting bigger in an area, expanding from its center. And as it expanded from its center, that meant more tax dollars could come in, but that also meant more utilities, more upkeep, and so forth. More power lines that had to be put down, more roads that had to be taken care of, and so forth. So this starts to increase the costs of cities trying to maintain these areas, and they're also having to pay more even as they're getting more taxes in. This means that they start redirecting a lot of their resources on things like road development to expanding into the suburbs, which is valuable for them. That also means, too, that downtown inner city areas, much as we get to see in the Little Shop of Horror assignment that we see for this particular video series, the critical thinking assignment, you get to see that the inner cities areas start to die. And so the downtown becomes something akin to what we would call Skid Row. It was a sort of poor area with few opportunities and few resources. As such, the inner city begins to die, and we see the suburbs rise and rise. Gentrification is changing that. We're now seeing that these areas that for so many years were poor and many people who had fewer resources were living there, they're now being broken up by new people deciding that living downtown would be great. Downtown Lexington's a great example of that. Again, going back in time to the Lexington that I used to visit long before I was a professor, it's nothing like it is now. It's completely different. In fact, that huge park space downtown used to be a whole building. A bunch of buildings. So it's a whole different experience there. We can think, though, about how place has impacted people's experiences, because by living in certain parts of the city, it's really shaped their experiences. What we see as a result of suburbanization, too, is some really strange things over time that have created issues. First off is the spatial mismatch hypothesis. What we found over time is that more and more of the jobs in inner city poor areas were leaving to other areas, the suburbs. As such, people who lived in these inner city areas didn't have access to many jobs. In fact, to get to the jobs, they would have had to have utilized a lot of mass transportation to try and get out to the suburbs to be able to have these jobs. But the problem is at that point, it becomes unaffordable to try to do that. We can think of places where you might try to have to drive 45 or 50 minutes by mass transportation just to get to your job. But then how much is the cost of time and money to get there impacted your ability for that job to even be a profitable experience? What ends up happening, too, is a lot of jobs move to suburbs and they end up being filled by teenagers rather than being filled by people who would need full-time work. So the spatial mismatch hypothesis is really problematic because the area where we have a lot of people who need jobs, there are no jobs. Likewise, the areas in the suburbs where we need to fill jobs, there aren't enough people. The second one is that we see these inner city areas ended up with a lot of lack of capital. Capital is the funds that you can use for starting a business. They often come in the form of a bank. But basically, the banks weren't willing to stay there anymore. In fact, they weren't willing to lend to people there, and they were moving out to the suburbs. This is something that remains today an issue. Particularly persons of color trying to use banks at all can be a problem in certain areas. So this is something that remains a big challenge for people living in certain areas to be able to access those funds. Particularly think, too, of Latinos as being immigrants. It's sometimes very difficult to work with banks through language barriers, through having the paperwork that they require. And so we often see people, rather than using a bank, choosing to just store their money. And in that situation, it doesn't gain any interest, but it's also not protected. It's a very dangerous situation. Lack of capital remains a problem, too, in a lot of inner city areas. Again, gentrification being something that's changing that, but in a very scary way. Isolation is finally a last problem. What we begin to see over time is fewer and fewer transportation options linked together with those particular isolated areas. It creates a sense of resentment too, because we see taxis may be less likely to go to those areas or less willing to drop off to those areas. There may be fewer bus and transit services going to those areas, or they may be less predictable. And so what it tends to do is isolate the area so that it feels separated. This often over time creates a strong sense of anger, and rightfully so, because you live in an area that you've been isolated. In fact, this is sort of a central element of these inner city areas that have been kind of set aside, is that it's almost like a city within a city, and it's been set aside to have a very different experience. That's why place and space really come into action here. The places that we live can have unpredictable experiences and unpredictable impacts in shaping our experiences. That leaves us with several questions. Things like, do persons in inner city areas experience the economy the same way as others? Likewise, are they experiencing open stratification systems in the way they might in the suburbs? These are some of the really useful questions as we think about how an urban area and where we live can shape our experiences. The thing that strikes me as an Appalachianist, an Appalachian scholar, and as a person who grew up in rural areas, in studying urban sociology, I quickly found out that some of the very same things that held true about inner city areas and how those shape your experiences deeply apply to being in a rural area. In fact, they're surprisingly similar because of that isolation factor that they've been set aside. With that in mind, we will talk about rural sociology in the coming weeks. Now, our next lecture is going to be about social epidemiology, where we talk about health and how things like space and where we live can shape that. And we'll use that as a transition into thinking about rural areas being our last lecture for the semester at this time. All right, that's it for urban sociology. Urban sociology is an extraordinary field. If you have questions about it, if it's something that you think you would like to study as an undergrad or graduate, come chat with me. I can definitely suggest some resources for doing that. Otherwise, take care, and I will see you in our next lecture series where we talk about social epidemiology. Take care.